And joining us again tonight to discuss the issue of pardons and the presidential actions today, Amherst College professor Austin Sarat, an expert in law and jurisprudence. Thank you so much, sir, for being with us again tonight. We had this conversation last night with round one. Here we are for round two. What is your main headline tonight?
I think that the president is determined to take the pardon power to a new low. I think what the president is showing is that he will use the pardon power to reward his friends, to be merciful to those who've engaged in corruption, to be generous to those who have shown utter disrespect for the law itself. The president's pardon power is vast, there's no doubt about that, but we need to look very carefully at the kinds of people and the kinds of crimes to which the president feels drawn to use his clemency power. And I must say, after what we've seen in the last 2 days, I think it would be very appropriate for the Congress of the United States to conduct an investigation.
Professor, certainly there are critics to these pardons, many of whom are infuriated, to say the least, that some of these pardons are people who were questioned and lied to the FBI in the Mueller investigation. But on the flip side, you have people who say throughout history, in fact, in recent history, you've had presidents also pardon friends or allies of theirs who have committed similar crimes. Can you walk us back through other presidential pardons that have drawn similar scrutiny as the ones President Trump is currently pardoning?
Sure, but let's start with the president. The president of the United States, President Trump, has not used the pardon power, including what he's done in the last 2 days. He hasn't used it very much. When he has used it, he's used it almost exclusively to to pay favor to his friends and to reward those who have shown their loyalty to him. There's some suspicion that the president has dangled pardons in return for the silence of people like Manafort and Stone. So we have to look, first of all, and see that the president doesn't use this power very much. And when he does, almost exclusively, he's used it to reward some pretty unsavory characters. There are more than 14,000 people who have pending clemency petitions. Surely the President of the United States, in examining who deserves clemency, could find people who merit it more than people like Jared Kushner's father-in-law. The clemency power has been controversial right from the beginning. George Washington's first use of clemency in 1785 was to pardon 2 people who fomented rebellion against the United States. And it was very, very controversial at its time. Andrew Johnson, after the Civil War, used his pardon power to pardon every Confederate soldier, people who had rebelled against the United States. And it was very controversial in its time. More recently, Gerald Ford, the pardon of Richard Nixon, roiled the nation. And as your lead-in showed, Bill Clinton's, some of his last pardons, especially the pardon of Mark Rich, who was a financier whose family subsequently contributed fair amounts of money to the Clinton Foundation. The pardon power has always been controversial. But I think we...
Professor, let me just jump in 1 second here. Just for folks who may say, well, listen, President Trump has used this power, numerically speaking, far less than some of his predecessors. And other presidents, too, have done this kind of thing for their allies, family, buddies, loyalists. What do you think makes this round different, if it indeed is different?
I think it's different because it seems that almost the only people that Trump is interested in granting clemency for are his buddies or people who have shown loyalty to him by not cooperating with the Mueller investigation. And But the president's pardon power sends a message. If we look at who it is that Donald Trump is favoring, he's favoring people who committed murder. He's favored people who've lied to law enforcement. Gerald Kushner's father is not an admirable character, tax evasion and witness tampering. So I think it's the unusually high percentage of the clemencies that have gone to these kinds of people that mark Donald Trump's use of clemency as really quite unusual.
Professor Austin Sarat, or Sarat, excuse me, I apologize. Thank you, as always, for your time. You've been with us a number of nights in a row to help us better understand the pardon process and the broad and irreversible power that all presidents have. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me again.